150 years ago, Abraham Lincoln sat in the White House. This month, January 1st, staring at a large clock as the hands approached midnight on what was perhaps the first American watch night. And he wondered out loud as he realized that the Emancipation Proclamation was about to become law of the land. He wondered out loud, what will become of the Negro? What will happen to the Negro when they benefit from total freedom, liberty, and legally sanctioned equality? This is the 84th birthday anniversary of Martin Luther King, Jr. Martin Luther King, Jr. answered Lincoln's question with his life. Every one of us must answer that question. It is a still very relevant question. I invite you to rise for our opening prayer and our annual crown form in tribute to our most famous alumnus. Mr. Rice.
Let us unite our hearts in prayer. Sovereign God, at the genesis of yet another academic semester, you in your infinite wisdom have afforded us another opportunity to become the expressed image of your essence, to deconstruct the facades and the images that we seemingly hide behind, and fortify our authentic selves in you. For this we are grateful. You have given us another chance to excel academically and to exceed beyond the expectations that have been set upon us by society. We come now to you in this sacred space as you surround us with your love, embrace us with your energy, convict us with your presence, and guide us with your spirit. Amidst our quotidian routines, allow us to pause and reflect upon the profundity of this moment. On this, the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation and the 84th birthday celebration of our progenitor and prophet, Dr. King. Remind us both individually and collectively of our calls. Recommit us to our communities. Realign our vision and make provisions for our visions. And at times, remember us, that we may always be citizens of a global community. In your many names we pray. Amen.
Good morning. It is time for us to end our love affair with yesterday. Sometimes it seems that we are so preoccupied with the past that we miss magical, marvelous, meaningful, matchless, magnificent, majestic moments right here in our present. I believe if Dr. King could stand before us today, he would ask, what are you doing with your life And what are you doing with your time? Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we have been graced to glance at our rich history behind us, but it is a sin to stare. When we glance, we see the way in which we have come, treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered. When we glance, we see the strength of Sojourner Truth and Jarena Lee. When we glance, we see the struggle of Frederick Douglass and Nat Turner. When we glance, we see the scars of Fannie Lou Hamer and hear the speeches of Malcolm X. When we glance, we see the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who became a Morehouse student at the age of 15, graduated at the age of 19, had a PhD by the age of 26, and dead by the age of 39. When we glance, we see Congress passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We have been graced to glance, but it is a sin to stare. We ought to have a regal, reverential respect for yesterday. We ought to have deference for yesterday. But if we don't change today, the problems of today will become a reality in our tomorrows. And that is why Robert Herrick wrote, "Gather ye rosebuds while ye may. Old time is still a-flying, and this same flower that smiles today, tomorrow will be dying." It means carpe diem, seize the day, use today, work today, grow today, find treasure in today. We have always fought for civil rights, but there are new fights today. Today we have new fights and new opportunities. Morehouse men and men of Morehouse ought to take the lead on issues of human rights and women's rights and gay rights and gun rights. We are needed today. Larry Ward, the chairman of the Gun Appreciation Day, which is slated to occur on January 19th, says that a Gun Appreciation Day would actually honor Dr. King. To say that is to spit on the legacy of Dr. King. Dr. King was killed by a gun and fought for nonviolence until the day of his death. We are needed today. Yes, we are graced to glance, but it is a sin to stare. All greatness is not in the cemetery. We have treasures and powerful leaders in our midst. I know you've heard of Dr. Benjamin Elijah Mays, but have you met Devin Jerome Crawford? I know that you've heard of Dr. Hugh Morris Gloucester, but have you met Honore Darrell Washington? I know you've heard of Mary McLeod Bethune, but have you met Dr. Ann Wimbush Watts? I know you've heard of Ella Baker, but have you met Anita Foster? I know you've heard of Thurgood Marshall, but have you met Jameson Miller? I know you've heard of W.E.B. Du Bois, but have you met Leland Shelton? I know you've heard of a Fred Shuttlesworth, but have you met Stephen Nelson? I know you've heard of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but you haven't seen anything until you look in your own mirror. King is dead. Thurman is dead. Mays is dead, but you are still alive. Gather ye rosebuds while ye may.
against wisdom, shall not prevail against wisdom, shall not prevail, shall not prevail, shall not prevail.
In most of my appearances in this space, I've followed the Glee Club for some strange reason. I don't know whose idea of programming that corresponds to, but we hear such wonderful sounds out of that group. And we take it for granted because we hear it every year. But I just want to recognize, as they deserve, that the Glee Club is one of the world's greatest musical ensembles. And Dr. Morrow, we want to thank you for the quality of what we hear from that Glee Club year in and year out. I also want to say that for those who were not here today, they will know, I predict this, they will know the voice and the message of Reginald Wayne Sharp, Jr., just an outstanding oration. Men of Morehouse, faculty, staff, friends, and special guests, it's my pleasure to introduce this morning's speaker, Dr. Orville Vernon Burton. Dr. Burton, who is a native of Georgia and a graduate of Furman University, earned his doctorate in American history from Princeton University. Currently, Dr. Burton serves Clemson University in 3 capacities: University Distinguished Professor of Humanities, Professor of History and Computer Science, and Director of the Clemson Cyber Institute. Prior to joining Clemson, he was the Burroughs Distinguished Professor of Southern History and Culture at Coastal Carolina University and the founding director of the Institute for Computing in the Humanities, Arts, and Social Science at the University of Illinois. At the University of Illinois, he is also Emeritus University Distinguished Teacher, Scholar, University Scholar, Professor of History, and African American Studies and Sociology. A scholar and teacher of the first rank, Dr. Burton is the author and editor of 16 books and more than 200 articles. He was presented the Chicago Tribune Heartline Literary Award and has been selected for the Book of the Month Club, the History Book Club, and the Military Book Club. 2 of his most noted works, The Age of Lincoln and In My Father's House, published in 2007 and 2008 respectively, were nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. As a teacher, Dr. Burton was selected as the 1999 U.S. Research and Doctoral University Teacher of the Year by the Carnegie Foundation and the Council for the Advancement and Support of Education. The American Historical Association presented him its Eugene Asher Distinguished Teaching Prize, and he was selected as an Organization of America Historians Distinguished Lecture. Our speaker is the recipient of fellowships, honors, and grants from the Rockefeller Foundation, the National Endowment of the Humanities, the National Science Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, and the U.S. Department of Education, just to name a few. His intellectual interests lie in the South, with special emphasis on race relations and the intersection of humanities and the social sciences. Please join me in giving a Morehouse welcome to one of the country's leading historians on the Civil War era, Dr. Orville Vernon Burton. Dr. Burton.
It is such an honor for me to be here. You cannot imagine. I am a great fan of Morehouse College, an extraordinary fan of Dr. Benjamin Mays, who's from my hometown of 96, South Carolina. One of the great tragedies of segregation, an era I grew up in, is that I did not know Dr. Mays, who came regularly to 96 to visit his family. And it was not until my senior year, in fact, at Furman during Religious Emphasis Week, when he came to speak there, that I met him and we became lifelong friends. Now, I thought that when I once spoke after Dr. Mays in a church that's named for him now in 96, South Carolina, that there would be the hardest act I have ever followed. But I think this might be it. What a tremendous oration and prayer and this music. So I am truly humbled, and I'm afraid you're sort of downhill in some ways from here after what you've heard. But Stephen Colbert, in the Colbert Report, said that in rewriting history is a good thing because we can make it better. He recommends that now that an African American is president, we can say that slavery never existed. Now, though done in humor, there are indications that in the court of popular opinion, as well as with some justices on the Supreme Court, this is some degree happening. The Chicago Tribune asked, does the election of a black president mean racism is no longer a factor in American politics? And are civil rights laws outdated in the age of Obama? That article examined legal briefs challenging the constitutionality of a section of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Echoing traditional states' right rhetoric that was used to defend slavery, segregation, and disfranchisement, Chief Justice Roberts wrote that the Voting Rights Act also differentiates between the states, despite our historic tradition that all the states enjoy equal sovereignty. Now, unlike the Earl Warren Court, which upheld the equal protection of individuals against racial discrimination was one of the principal duties of the U.S. Supreme Court, the Roberts courts argued that the court's role is more to protect the rights of the states to deal with voting as they wish. Justice Roberts continued in a not-so-veiled threat to overturn the Voting Rights Act. In a later case, he stated, whether conditions continue to justify such legislation is a difficult constitutional question we do not answer today. And the Tribune seems to agree on the grounds that Obama's election heralds the emergence of a colorblind society in which special legal safeguards for minorities are no longer required. I think we know better than that. Now, much of my time this past summer was spent as an expert witness against the South Carolina voter ID law. History plays a major role in how to interpret voting rights. The work of Martin Luther King Jr. helped bring about the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Today, however, if opponents cannot deny the right to vote, they can try to obstruct the ability to vote. Now, I was a historian of the American South for 34 years at the University of Illinois. I wrote a book on Abraham Lincoln, The Age of Lincoln, moved back home, and discovered that, in fact, people don't like Lincoln very much down here, even though I argued he was a Southerner. When I returned home, I wanted to come back to make a difference in the tradition that my hero, Ben Mays, had, who I believe is the single greatest person to ever come out of South Carolina. And I've been disturbed, particularly when I look at education, and not just in South Carolina, but throughout the South, throughout the nation. There's only so many bricks that can be laid, so many yards can be tended, so much wire can be pulled. We are now in a transition, just as in the age of Lincoln, people were moving from a farming society, an artisan craftsman society, to an age of manufacturing. We're now moving from a manufacturing society to a knowledge-based society, and we face an extraordinary crisis in education today. My study of Lincoln and emancipation leads very directly to the relationship between freedom and education. Thomas Jefferson wrote that if a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be. In the mid-1800s, when reformers began a push for better higher education, they saw the need for colleges to offer practical knowledge and more science in this developing democratic republic. Darwin's The Origin of the Species appeared in 1859, which is the same year that President Buchanan vetoed a bill calling for land-grant colleges. It was 3 years later, in the midst of a terrible civil war, that President Lincoln signed acts instituting the Morrill Act and the National Academy of Sciences, an American way of saying that we're moving into a new age of inquiry. In the 19th century, land-grant colleges were called people's colleges, they were called farmers' colleges, and they were called democracy's colleges. That's a title I love, and one I think describes what education is really all about. And I believe we need to claim that mantle again. Certainly that is what Dr. Mays did for Morehouse, and through the Morehouse men helped change America for the better. Whether at the elementary, secondary, or college levels, such as at Morehouse, today we need the kind of leadership that gave us land-grant colleges. Lincoln's leadership was often questioned by his contemporaries because he thought things through before taking action. In the autumn of 1862, Lincoln moved from hesitation to boldness on a decision of momentous consequence, a decision on emancipation that he had been contemplating for some time. Tens of thousands of African Americans have been walking away from slavery as soon as the Union forces came close, and their journey toward freedom caused enormous headaches for military administration at all levels. Soldier bureaucrats created a crazy patchwork of conflicting, shifting policies as they attempted to deal with local situations that were becoming more complicated and more dire with every passing week. Even Southern newspapers realized that whenever a Yankee army has appeared, practical emancipation has followed. Because Lincoln did not find the war about slavery, but about preserving the Union, some have argued that Lincoln was not anti-slavery and the Emancipation Proclamation was only a desperate wartime measure. People often ask now, why did Lincoln just not let South Carolina and the South go? What was so great about preserving the Union? What did it matter? And many suggested that he let them go. I think you have to put this in perspective. You start, in fact, with Lincoln calling it the last best hope. And here's what he meant by that. Why do you preserve the Union? He had been poor. I mean, it is not true that he actually built the log cabin with a dirt floor he was born in, but he was born in a log cabin with a dirt floor. And he had rose because of democracy and American opportunity. You began with the American Revolution and then the French Revolution with the idea that men, excluding women, but men could govern themselves away from monarchy. And then you have the number of little republics, particularly in Latin America, and democracies that are formed with this idea of democracy and republics that are spreading. But Napoleon comes about in France, of course, and puts a monarch back on the throne. The revolutions of 1848 all failed. Napoleon III puts Maximilian on the throne of what had been a republic and a democracy in Mexico. So one by one, all are failing. The great hero of democracy, the Italian Garibaldi, reunites Italy, and instead of becoming the democracy he wants it to, it again becomes a monarchy. When you understand that the South, and moving much more toward hierarchy and believing that all men could not govern themselves, is in line with what's going on in the history of the world, one understands what Lincoln really means by the last best hope. But because he did define this war, in fact, about preserving the Union and not about slavery, people such as longtime Ebony magazine editor Lerone Bennett, the celebrated Morehouse graduate and my good friend, concluded that Lincoln was a white supremacist, only reluctantly forced into glory by others and circumstances, not by his own deep-held beliefs that slavery was wrong. In other words, emancipation was an act of desperate pragmatism, not ethical statesmanship. At a session on my book, The Age of Lincoln, at the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, every African American scholar younger than I could not say anything good about Lincoln. For many African Americans, Lincoln has gone from the great emancipator to the great white honky. With the civil rights movement, historians' interest shifted from slavery to race and racism, and Lincoln's more gradualist policy was seen as inadequate. So much so that one historian found in 1961 that the great emancipator was characterized as the perfect embodiment of Northern racism. Now, while that may be overstated, we need to understand that leaders like Lincoln were flawed, and we have to judge them by their own time and place. Lincoln had demons, maybe more than most of us do, and it's a whole nother lecture, but how Lincoln dealt with those demons, I think, help account for his greatness, in fact. Like most people in the 19th century, Lincoln used the N-words and told racist jokes. That does not mean we should not value his heroic characteristics and efforts. In 1864, a delegation of African-American men came to see Lincoln to request equal pay for leaders. 19-year-old African-American Henry Samuels remembered the event, wrote it down, how Lincoln listened quietly. Then, according to Samuels, Lincoln said in a jocular manner, "Well, gentlemen, you wish the pay of Cuffy raised." The story might have ended there with the patronizing tone of Lincoln. But Samuels, remember he's only 19, and he confronts the President of the United States and says that we do not make use of the word Cuffy in our vernacular, that they were there to request the wages of the American colored labor be equalized with those of the American white labor. Lincoln, the president, apologized. He told Samuels, "I stand corrected, young man, but you know, I am by birth a Southerner, and in our section that term is applied without any idea of an offensive nature." But unlike so many others, Lincoln got the idea. Lincoln went on to say that he would, at the very possible earliest moment, do all in my power to accede to your request. Wages were equalized only a month later. This and a lot of other collaborating evidence have shown that Lincoln's incredible, flexible mind allowed him to grow so that by the end of the Civil War, he was leading the nation to a better place on race. To appreciate this change in Lincoln is a good thing in a democracy. We can grow better on issues when we are open-minded and willing to learn more about them. Today, we excoriate politicians who change their minds on a subject. Flip-flop has become a bad word, yet new information influenced what Lincoln understood, and he was willing to adjust his ideas, and thank goodness he was a flip-flopper. One way to put Lincoln's racism into historical context is a comparison between Lincoln and the major political figure of the day, Stephen A. Douglas. Douglas was much more in line with the rest of white America, both North and South. It is important to compare Lincoln to Douglas because we see a quite different perspective. And only by talking about Stephen Douglas' advocacy for white supremacy, something we don't like to do in our history, that is, talk about the bad things. But I think you have to understand where Lincoln was. And what Douglas interpreted as white supremacy to be, in fact, constitutionalism, as he interpreted it. And his use of the race card to mobilize voters, then we can appreciate where Lincoln was on race. I'm amazed that when I ask students what they know about the Lincoln-Douglas debate, and they'll say, well, Lincoln's this tall, 6'4" dude, Douglas is short, squat little fella like you. And I want to say, you know, who cares? What's important is that Lincoln and Douglas were debating two visions of America. Stephen Douglas was the most dynamic politician of his age, the leading light of the Democratic Party, and he stood blatantly for white supremacy. Douglas pronounced after the Dred Scott decision, "This government of ours is founded on the white basis. It was made by the white man, for the benefit of the white man, to be administered by white men in such manners as they should determine." Lincoln's challenge against white supremacy then was truly heroic, and Douglas went after him because of it. In criticizing Lincoln for his reticence toward emancipation, people have referenced his letter in response to Horace Greeley. In August 1862, Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune, printed his prayer of 20 million, that was the exact population of the free states, and appealed to free the slaves. Lincoln responded to Greeley in the newspaper, a conservative one, the National Intelligencer. Many of his critics leave out the last line of that letter, which distinguished between his official duty and his beliefs. Lincoln wrote that he intended, quote, "no modification of my oft-expressed personal wish that all men everywhere should be free." Yet for Lincoln, saving the Union was paramount, as he wrote to the nation by way of Greeley. "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." And yet Lincoln had already decided to issue the Emancipation Proclamation well before Greeley's August letter. He had announced to his cabinet in July and to Secretary of State Seward and Secretary of Navy Gideon Weld even earlier. So why didn't he say, "Hey, you're right, Horace, and guess what I have right here in my desk ready to go?" The reason is a brilliant political stance. He calmed conservative fears about abolition while paving a way forward by declaring that emancipation and preserving the Union might advance together. Ultimately, the Emancipation Proclamation would free some and leave others alone. Lincoln used a military draw at Antietam, what he called a victory, even though more Americans were killed in one day than had ever happened before, to announce his emancipation plan, which was to take effect on New Year's Day, 1863. Lincoln gave the South an ultimatum. He allowed them 3.5 months to come back into the Union with slavery intact. His proclamation announced that thereafter all persons held in slavery in rebellious states shall be then, thenceforth, and forever free. The Emancipation Proclamation was not effective in Confederate-held territory because the U.S. Army was not in a position to enforce it, and it did not cover enslaved workers held by loyal slaveholders in the Union border states. As one British newspaper wrote, the principle asserted is not that a human being cannot justly own another, but he cannot own him unless he is loyal to the United States. Lincoln's audience, however, well knew the ramifications. For African Americans, the meaning of freedom from captivity ran as clearly through their spirituals as it did through the book of Exodus. When Israel was in Egypt's land, "Let my people go," oppressed so hard they could not stand, "Oh, let my people go." Like Pharaoh, Confederates were not about to let their people go just because of a proclamation from Lincoln. It would take victory and the 13th Amendment to the Constitution to make it official nationwide. Nevertheless, the end of slavery was now United States policy. To Southerners, the most threatening part of the proclamation was Union-sanctioned slave rebellion. Emancipation also called for allowing African Americans to serve in the Union armed services at a time when manpower needs were critical. Almost 200,000 African American men mustered in the federal service over the next 2 years. Black regiments that saw combat before Appomattox demonstrated courage and discipline in each and every instant, teaching the North what white Southerners had always dreaded most. Given the opportunity, African Americans would not hesitate to shed their own blood and that of their oppressors in a war to overthrow slavery. The proclamation had a major effect on the course of the war. Immediately, Southerners had to put an even greater emphasis on controlling their enslaved workers, leaving less time and money available for the war effort. Moreover, it ended any question of European intervention. With Northern articulation that the war was now about the moral issue of slavery, the English and French decided it was not their interest to recognize the Confederacy's independence. The measure also clarified war aims. The war for the Union was now undeniably a war for freedom. Though it was a war measure, Lincoln clearly presented it as a justice measure as well. When he addressed Congress, he spoke about how, in giving freedom to the slave, we assure freedom to the free, honorable alike in what we give and what we preserve. Countries around the world supported the proclamation as a strike against slavery and for liberty. Now, this hero of two continents, the Italian Garibaldi, had actually been offered to command U.S. troops when the Civil War began. He asked if the war was about slavery. If so, he was ready to fight for liberty and freeing slaves anywhere in the world, and he would take command. But he was told no, the war was not about ending slavery, but preserving the Union. So he said, if it's just a civil war, I don't want to be involved. After the Emancipation Proclamation, Garibaldi writes to Lincoln and about Lincoln, "Heir of the thought of Christ and of John Brown, you will pass down to posterity under the name of the Emancipator." France also was impressed. One newspaper was not concerned that it was merely a first step because time and contagion of liberty will do the rest. Frederick Douglass wrote, "We shout for joy that we live to record this righteous decree. For all his Lincoln's moderation, he had struck an epoch-making blow for human liberty." The Emancipation Proclamation captured public imagination with the idea of burgeoning freedom. On the 1st of January, 1863, no chains fell off that morning, and the heavens did not open, but America's central meaning was transformed. And yet freedom had to be kept alive. Even as he hoped the military course would proceed to the Union advantage and end in victory, Lincoln knew it was possible that some form of slavery could be reinstated after the war. The first step was the 13th Amendment. passed by the Senate and the House of Representatives, and for the first time ever, a president signed that amendment. That is how committed Lincoln was to the 13th Amendment. And Congress resented it, actually passed a resolution condemning him for doing it. And of course, it was adopted after Lincoln's death on December the 6th, 1865. Slavery was gone, but Lincoln knew a meaningful vote was necessary to protect one's freedom. He actually was killed for that idea, not the Emancipation Proclamation. When Grant accepted Lee's surrender, Lincoln delivered a speech from the White House balcony to the gathering crowd. He spoke about the need for citizenship for the valiant African Americans who fought for the Union. One listener at this speech, John Wilkes Booth, read his darkest fears into Abraham Lincoln's vision and told his companion, that means the N-word, citizenship. Now, by God, I'll put him through. This is the last speech he will ever make. 3 days later, Lincoln was shot. Lincoln's advocacy for voting rights for African American soldiers are logical extensions of the arguments presented in the Emancipation Proclamation and at his Gettysburg Address in November 1863 precipitated the murder. Before the Gettysburg Address and the Emancipation Proclamation, both of them are documents of freedom, and you have to read them together. You cannot see where Lincoln was going unless you take the Emancipation Proclamation and put it with the Gettysburg Address as he tries to explain what he's doing here. While the language of the Emancipation Proclamation dug deep into legal, contractual, logical reasoning, the Gettysburg Address soared. Lincoln wanted to capture the heart of the whole country, to move beyond a war measure, a legal document proclaiming that slavery was no more. He wanted to redefine the meaning of freedom. The Gettysburg Address held the grandeur and emotion of poetry. The Emancipation Proclamation spoke in legalese. A simple tool, a word cloud, actually illustrates the comparison here. And I have some examples. A word cloud shows the number of times. Okay, I think it's right. Yeah. The word cloud shows the number of times certain words are used, and the more times it's used, the larger the size and prominence in the word cloud. It basically counts words. But of course, words hold meaning, and so accounting highlights concepts. This is the Gettysburg Address. The first example here shows a word cloud generated from the Gettysburg Address. The word used here most is dedicated, a word with immense religious significance, and a word Lincoln heard often in the churches he attended with his wife, Mary. Consecrated, hallowed, and devotion all share these same religious connotation, while nation is the second most used. Comparing this word cloud with one generated from the text of the Emancipation Proclamation offers some analysis of how Lincoln used particular words on the two different occasions. Whoops, I cut it off, I guess. All right. This is Emancipation Proclamation. In this visualization, there are very different kinds of words. The words are more legalistic. One does not see the dedicate, devotion, or nation. The Emancipation Proclamation highlights words like rebellion, necessary, authority, and designated, all of which are about establishing the legitimacy of Lincoln's order. By looking at this word cloud, it becomes clear the Emancipation Proclamation emphasizes persons, and also persons Gettysburg Address. Overshadowing the words of the Emancipation Proclamation's image, though, are the words United and States, with states significantly larger. Whereas the Gettysburg Address uses nation, the Emancipation Proclamation refers to the United States. While this could simply be a legalistic decision over a more emotive one, Lincoln's word usage in the Emancipation Proclamation is more authoritative. There is a subtle but important difference between these two documents. And the next one, let's hope we can, there we are. These are two. On one, you have, in fact, a huge corpus, 5 volumes of the collected Lincoln works. And the one at the top on the left are all the words that Lincoln uses from his inauguration, March 4th, 18, until the Gettysburg Address. The other one is a word cloud from the Gettysburg Address until his last speech. Some visualization here, I think, highlights some interesting comparisons. One would expect the word slavery to be used much more before the Emancipation, and that's clear here. Noteworthy is Lincoln's use of the words united and states. They're prominent in both word clouds, but in the earlier writing, states is much larger than united. And in those from the Gettysburg Address, the two are much closer in size. And the word new takes special significance. These word clouds suggest there is a shift in emphasis for Lincoln, beginning with the Emancipation Proclamation and the Gettysburg Address with its articulation of a new birth of freedom. Now, while Lincoln believed that the Emancipation Proclamation was, quote, the central act of my administration, the great event of the 19th century, and he said if he would be remembered for anything, it would in fact be for the Emancipation Proclamation, I actually argue in the age of Lincoln that it's Lincoln's understanding of liberty and what he did with liberty for the United States and the world that is the greatest legacy of the 19th century. And that Benjamin E. Mays and, in fact, Martin Luther King Jr. understood this meaning of liberty that was transformed under Lincoln is so significant. Lincoln revolutionized personal freedom in the United States by assuring that it was protected by law. Basically, Lincoln inserted the Declaration of Independence, which I see as our mission statement, into our rule book, the Constitution. Part of the legacy of Lincoln is this new birth of freedom, and it involves a redefinition of the role of government in securing liberty. Prior to the Civil War, we the people wanted freedom from government. The Bill of Rights protected the people from governmental powers. Amendment 1 begins, Congress shall make no law respecting. The 14th and 15th Amendments, adopted after Lincoln's assassination, but which are part of his legacy, revolutionized personal freedom in the United States by assuring that it was protected by law. The Reconstruction Amendments state that Congress shall have power to enforce. Lincoln institutionalized positive liberty. His legacy includes emancipation, but builds upon it by specifying in the United States Constitution equal citizenship and voting rights. Emancipation was a successful and lasting revolution brought about by the actions of African Americans, the courage of black and white abolitionists, and the convictions of Abraham Lincoln. From Benjamin Butler's refusal at Fort Monroe, Virginia, to return a fugitive from slavery, through the Confiscation Acts of Congress, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, and the 13th Amendment, emancipation succeeded. The goal of reconstructing government on racial equality, while never predestined for failure, was far more wide-ranging. Liberty and freedom are the interpretive centerpieces, the thesis of the age of Lincoln. Told as a story of freedoms and liberty rather than of the enslaved's emancipation, the 19th century makes greater sense. If we place emancipation as one point on a long continuum of freedoms and unfreedoms, we can see where emancipation fits, and thus we see why former slaves demanded much more. Many African Americans were aware that the newfound freedom now included the freedom to starve. To be truly free, many asserted they needed three things. They needed land, which they had cultivated and harvested for hundreds of years. They needed to protect their rights with the ability to vote, and they needed education. Because Lincoln was about opportunity, he stood firmly on the side of education. In a little book I did, probably the most difficult book, as small as it is, I ever wrote, The Essential Lincoln, I was challenged to select only 30 documents that tell us Lincoln and who he was and how he changed. Two of those center on education. The first, in fact, comes out of the first time that we have a statement by Lincoln by politics. In 1832, after the ambitious 23-year-old had just moved to New Salem and announced he was a candidate for the Illinois legislature, he proclaimed education the most important subject which we as a people can be engaged in. There's a second lengthier endorsement of education. This is the Wisconsin State Agricultural Society in Milwaukee in 1859. And here he's answering South Carolina Senator James Henry Hammond, class-based, pro-slavery, mud seal theory. When I was a boy, there were still mud seals. People would have them on their door, on their porch before you came in so you could scrape the mud off. And these rail fences that you had, that's sort of a symbol for structures, the bottom rail was often called the mud rail. And you can imagine with a pig pen how muddy those could be an idea. And Hammond's idea was that every society was like a fence. You had to have a bottom rail, and that rail should be slavery. And of course, he actually meant beyond just racial slavery for all workers. But in the South, it had been what made it unique was racial slavery. So Lincoln is taking on this idea. And people have often thought in this speech that he is defending, in fact, free labor. But I think it is much more, if you hear what he says, about education and how democracy demands education. So Lincoln, this is a long quote, but please bear with me. I think it's worth listening to. By the mud seal theory, it is assumed that labor and education are incompatible, and any practical combination of them impossible. According to that theory, a blind horse upon a treadmill is a perfect illustration to what a laborer should be. All the better for being blind that he cannot tread out of place or kick understandingly. According to that theory, the education of laborers is not only useless, but pernicious and dangerous. In fact, it is in some sort deemed a misfortune that laborers should have heads at all. But free labor says no. Free labor argues that as the author of man makes every individual with one head and one pair of hands, it was probably intended that heads and hands should cooperate as friends, and that that particular head should direct and control that particular pair of hands. In one word, free labor insists on universal education. Lincoln believed in education as a way to open one's mind and learn other points of view. He also knew that democracy was dependent upon it. Lincoln changed his views on race as he met and listened carefully to African Americans like Frederick Douglass, Robert Small, Martin Delany, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, and others. Such African American leaders, as well as countless other leaders in African American communities, often ministers and preachers, took steps during and immediately after the war to organize freed people. In the spring and summer of 1865, African Americans called conventions to discuss how to make ideals of liberty their own. African American minister Garrison Frazier spoke for his Baptist congregation in Savannah, Georgia, about what freedom meant, taking us from under the yoke of bondage and placing us where we could reap the fruits of our own labor, take care of ourselves, and assist the government in maintaining our freedom. According to Reverend James Keelan of New Orleans, all we want now is our rights and religious privileges to live as Christians in a Christian country. We have raised your children, cleaned up your grounds, and enriched you. Now let us go. Churches fostered education. All across the South in the months after Appomattox, African American communities opened up whatever building was available to create a space for volunteers to gather, teach, and learn together. Often proceeding under church leadership, freed people contributed their labor and their very limited funds to help build new schools, hire teachers, and organize communities. White minister Reverend William Richardson of the American Missionary Association went to Savannah in early 1865 to check the feasibility of starting a school. He found that Savannah Freedom had already collected $750 and launched a school with several local teachers. In Beaufort County, South Carolina, Civil War hero Robert Smalls hired a tutor during the war to teach him to read, described himself as deeply interested in the common school system. He bought and donated the land for a school to which freedmen came at all hours expecting to catch a lesson. The vast majority of freed African Americans saw educational opportunity as integral to freedom, part and parcel of their determination never to be made slaves again. Freedman Charles Whiteside of North Carolina said that education was the next best thing to liberty. Northern schoolmarms such as African American Edmonia Highgate from New York came south to help. A member of the American Missionary Association teaching in Louisiana, she wrote, "The majority of my pupils come from plantations, 3, 4, and even 8 miles distant. So anxious are they to learn that they walk these distances so early in the morning is never to be tardy." She also wrote about local opposition to the school and how she and some of her students had been shot at. The nearest military protection is 200 miles away in New Orleans. Laura Towns from Pennsylvania started Penn School on St. Helena Island, South Carolina, in the middle of the Civil War as part of the Port Royal experiment. That school lasted 78 years before becoming Penn Center, which African Americans now direct. And of course, this is where King held his retreats and planning sessions, and which promotes black land ownership and preservation of the Gullah Geechee language and culture, as well as African American heritage. When Southern whites took control of the state and dismantled the interracial democracy of Reconstruction, the African American on St. Helena petitioned the government to allow them to tax themselves for the benefit of the local schools. Ultimately, the federal government failed to enforce its own law or to protect the rights of African American citizens. But while the 1865 Freedmen's Bureau Act, the various Reconstruction Acts, Force Acts, and Civil Rights Act, and the 14th and 15th Amendments did not produce equality, African Americans made considerable gains that were to last them through the following years of trial. Land ownership did increase. Learning institutions of higher education continued to grow. If the outward effect of reform decreased, the inner spirit of the freedmen and women continued to thrive. Political equality and economic opportunity could be and were taken away, but the knowledge of freedom and its potential could not be. Just as important, African Americans had created an interracial democracy, and that experience gave the community hope for the future. The end of Reconstruction never meant the end of hope. Hope involved a deep thirst for knowledge in African American communities. Each gain proved cumulative. From basic literacy and rude arithmetic, freed people mounted upward. A lasting legacy of Reconstruction was a vigorous advocacy of public education for all the people in the South. Among the hundreds of secondary schools and colleges founded during Reconstruction was the Augusta Institute in Georgia in 1867, founded by William Jefferson White, a Baptist minister and cabinet maker. In 1885, it moved to Atlanta on the land donated by a fellow Baptist, John D. Rockefeller. In 1906, Dr. John Hope, its first African-American president, guided the college toward rigorous academics. In 1913, the college was named Morehouse in honor of Dr. Henry L. Morehouse. Morehouse and other religious institutions grew to be prestigious academies that support a vision of higher education beyond the agricultural and vocational skills as advocated by Booker T. Washington. Dr. Benjamin Eliza Mays, who became president of Morehouse in 1940, was mentor to thousands of students, among whom was Martin Luther King, Jr. And Dr. Mays told me over and over again how proud he was of the fact that of all ethnic groups, of all different groups in America, African Americans listed education as what counted most in terms of social status. That's something that he was really proud of, and I think it's something we need to think about. It was 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation that Martin Luther King, Jr. gave his famous speech at the Lincoln Memorial on August 28, 1963. In what we call the I Have a Dream speech, he evoked Lincoln. 50 years ago, a great American, in whose symbolic shadow we stand today, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. King, of course, was fighting the system of white supremacy that denied African Americans their citizenships and their voting rights. In honoring the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. at the sesquicentennial of the Emancipation Proclamation, we need to reflect on the meaning of freedom today. There's been progress yet, but the call for justice and equality that was part of Lincoln's unfinished business remains unfinished today. And I just want to do a quick conclusion from the age of Lincoln and be very brief with this. Lincoln recast America's purpose, and his call for a new birth of freedom came to fruition in new amendments to the Constitution, none of which was inevitable, all of which promised to embrace an equality of opportunity that transcended any particular exclusionary right. Under rulings that touted separate but equal, the U.S. Supreme Court put to rest those millennial schemes of equality. Nevertheless, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments would continue to promise freedom from slavery, equal protection under the law, and the right to vote. Even as the darkness of the nadir began to settle over the land, a handful of believing blacks and a smaller number still of trusting whites put their faith in the law and continued to work on redrawing freedom's boundaries. In the passing of the age, Americans gave up old dreams of heavenly perfection and enshrined new hopes of material progress, incremental, tangible, calculable in dollars and dimes, full bellies, and fine clothes. In place of noble statesmen and great leaders, they trumpeted clean hands and efficient administration. In place of pure hearts, gentle spirits, and feminized conscience, they held up manly toil, stoic endurance, and the virtue of struggling self-interest. But in the American mind, the Civil War itself never truly ended. It was transmuted to a romantic memory, the stuff of elaborate weekend rituals, of bloodless battles during which no contraband crossed enemy lines at risk of life. It flowered into a national pastime for vacationing families that took in the emotional majesty of Little Round Top and Cemetery Ridge without making sure to wrestle likewise with untold lynchings across America. Whether found in the shock of a geneticist discovering slaves in one's family or in the waste of New Orleans' devastated Ninth Ward, the war is with us still, as myth and reality both. Just as in the age of Lincoln, moral choice, democratic citizenship, and equality still mingle. Determined that the thing can and shall be done, wrote Abraham Lincoln, and then we shall find the way. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was such an honor to be here with you.
Gentlemen, a few announcements. And Perhaps I should make one before you go out the door. The attendance will be taken right here. The sheets will be right here on the stage, attendance sheets. One moment, please. Dr. Watts is trying to get my attention. Hold on. Yes, ma'am? Okay, Dr. Watts says only those who don't have ID cards will sign the sheets. The scanners are working, but please, we're not dismissed. I have some announcements for you, and we have some guests I want to introduce. There's an opportunity for some of you who wish to travel abroad free, and also to travel there with a stipend as a gift. You may do this by competing in an essay contest sponsored by the King Collection Office. The deadline for the essay is February 25. You would write on Martin King's letter from the Birmingham jail. Read and analyze the letter, reflect upon the relevancy of his ideas, key themes and issues that resonate therein, continuities and disjunctions between the issues that King and his generation faced and those that you face today. If you're interested in competing, you can pick up the forms in the Leadership Center where the King Collection Office is located. I want you to be aware that we have with us today Mr. Jamil Zanadan, President of the Georgia Humanities Council, who is a partner with the chapel for this program and others. Would you please rise? Here he is right here. Thank you so very much. We also have with us Miss Jackie Royster, Dean of the Ivan Allen College of Liberal Arts at Georgia Tech Institute of Technology. Would you please rise? Okay. And we have Dr. Nelson T. Strober, Professor of Christian Education from the Gettysburg Lutheran Seminary, and students who are part of his Martin Luther King Jr. seminar. Significant that you're here. Won't you please rise? Oh, there they are. We are aware this is the 150th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address. Now I would like, as is our tradition, the members of Alpha to come and form in this aisle, and the Martin Luther King International Chapel Assistants to form in this aisle. The two floral wreaths are to be carried and placed in front of the King statue, the only statue of Dr. King in the state of Georgia. You may do that single file led by the presidents of Alpha Rho. Please make way for them. The rest of you, you may please rise and join hands for the singing of Dear Old Morehouse.
Dear
Our speaker for today will be available at 5:30 when the chapel assistants meet in the library.